Welcome, friends, to this course on understanding absurdist drama. We are in week 1, and this is going to be lecture number 2. We are going to discuss philosophical antecedents of the absurd with special reference to two major philosophers, Soren Kierkegaard and Jean-Paul Sartre. Our goal would be to discuss the existentialist philosophy of these two major European philosophers and how their philosophical worldview influenced absurdist theatre and other genres of literature. Soren Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher born in the year 1813. He died in the year 1855 at the young age of 42. However, within a very short span of time, Kierkegaard was able to write so many important works that they continue to influence philosophers and writers of today. His three major works are Either or, which was published in the year 1843. In Either and Or, Soren Kierkegaard contrasts two modes of living: the aesthetic life, focused on personal pleasure and immediacy, and the ethical life centered on responsibility, commitment, and moral choice. Kierkegaard argues that ethical life offers deeper meaning while the aesthetic life leads to despair and existential crisis. What we need to understand here that Kierkegaard is suggesting that there are two ways in which a human being can live in this world. One way is to live a life of indulgence, a life of pleasure, a life lived on this earth in earthly manner. And that's what he calls aesthetic life, life dependent upon pleasures. The other life, according to Kierkegaard, is ethical life, which has to be lived along the principles of ethics, along the principles of religion, and along the lines of faith. And that's why faith is a very important word, a key word in Kierkegaard's philosophy, which we will discuss in time to come. Another important work by Kierkegaard was Fear and Trembling. In this book, Kierkegaard explored the concept of faith through the biblical story of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice his son Isaac. He argues that true faith involves a leap beyond reason and ethics into the realm of the absurd, where the individual must trust in God despite the apparent irrationality of divine commands. Kierkegaard's argument is very interesting. Question before any human being is whether he should believe in God or he should not believe in God. And if he or she believes in God, whether his belief in God should be a matter of faith or of reason and rationality. According to Kierkegaard, belief in God is a matter of faith. And faith here is not superstitious. Faith here is not irrational. What faith is? Faith, according to Kierkegaard, is a leap beyond reason. Unless human beings take that leap, unless they believe in God beyond greed, beyond fear, their leap of faith in God is not possible. And therefore, for Kierkegaard, faith is a very important word to understand the self, to understand the world, and also to understand God, which are interlinked. Another very important book by Kierkegaard was The Sickness unto Death. In this book, Kierkegaard examines the nature of despair, describing it as a spiritual condition resulting from the misalignment of self with its true identity, which is grounded in a relationship with God. He argues that despair arises from either not realizing one's dependence on God or refusing to accept it, and only faith can resolve this existential crisis. Kierkegaard's argument is very clear, it's very evident. Kierkegaard had read Buddhist philosophy, and of course one can see the influence of Buddhism on his writings. Buddha has famously said, this world is suffering. That was the first noble truth of Buddha. Now Buddha's famous slogan that the world is suffering finds echoes in the philosophy of Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard also considers that despair is the condition of human existence. To imagine a human life without sorrow, without suffering, without despair is an impossibility. And that's why we would discuss his concept of despair in detail in slides to come. Now, if one reads the philosophical works of Kierkegaard, one finds out certain major philosophical precepts which are key to understanding Kierkegaard. One, truth is subjectivity. What does Kierkegaard mean when he says truth is subjectivity? Kierkegaard classifies truth into two types, objective truth and subjective truth. Objective truth refers to facts and knowledge that are external, impersonal and verifiable, such as scientific or historical truth. It emphasizes detached understanding and certainty. In other words, objective truths are truths of facts, are truths of the things, and therefore they are verifiable, they are data-based, you can say, or they are objective truths, possible through reason, through rationality, through data, information, so on and so forth. But what is subjective truth according to Kierkegaard? And he writes, and I quote, "Subjective truth is truth for me that generates a passion of inwardness that is worth my total self-commitment." What Kierkegaard means is that subjective truth is concerned with personal experience, with inwardness, with individual existence. He argues that for matters of faith, ethics and meaning, subjective truth is more important as it involves a passionate commitment and the way one relates to truth personally. He famously claims that truth of Christianity is not in its objective proofs, but in the subjective inward leap of faith. Let us pause for a moment and think. You see, if one has to know about God, can one know God objectively? Can there be a rational proof for the existence of God? You can give n number of proofs for existence of God, and equally significant number of proofs can also be given to disapprove that there is God. And therefore, what Kierkegaard says, if one has to know God, one cannot know God objectively, through reason, through rationality, through scientific proofs. The proof of existence of God is dependent upon the inward experience, inner experience. One has to go deeper into oneself and one has to find out the meaning of God, and Kierkegaard calls it leap of faith from reason, from rationality, and then only one can discover the truth of God. So what one has to understand here, that truth is not objective, truth is rather subjective. Truth is not in data, truth is not in facts, truth lies in inwardness of experience. That is a major philosophical argument Kierkegaard is giving, because that will change the way human self and human subjectivity was conceptualized. That is the first point we have to understand, we have to reflect upon. Another important idea, which is also related to the idea of truth and the idea of despair that we are going to discuss, is that of existential anxiety. Kierkegaard defines existential anxiety as the dizziness of freedom. He says, and I quote, "Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, which emerges when the spirit wants to posit the synthesis and freedom, looks down into its own possibility, laying hold of finiteness to support itself." Now we have to understand that the idea of anxiety is irrevocably and inextricably tied to the concept of freedom. Anxiety, especially angst or existential anxiety, emerges when an individual becomes aware of the infinite choices before them. This awareness creates a sense of uncertainty and dread, not because of specific fears, but because of the burden of responsibility that freedom entails. Now you have to understand here that anxiety here is not a medical condition that Kierkegaard is talking about. Kierkegaard opines that anxiety is a philosophical concept and all human beings suffer from what he calls angst or existential anxiety. And the moment of the origin of existential anxiety is the moment a human being is given infinite number of choices. For example, whether one has to serve one's ailing mother or one has to serve one's country. Should one prefer serving the mother more or should one prefer serving the country more? What should be the choice that one should make? Now, when an individual will be confronted between these two choices, he will suffer existential anxiety because he will be on a moment when individuals confront the boundless nature of their freedom, when people realize that they have freedom to make choices and define their own lives. People will experience this existential anxiety as a sense of dizziness or vertigo. This feeling comes from awareness that they are responsible for their actions and the consequences, with no predetermined path or external guidance, which can be both liberating and terrifying. Now, what one has to understand that freedom entails a lot of responsibility. As long as there was this idea that there is a God, one could make God responsible for whatever happens to one. But when one has freedom to choose, when God is not there to choose for you, when you are responsible for what you choose, then you also have to suffer the consequences of your choice. And this dilemma, this conflict will create the moments of what Kierkegaard calls existential anxiety. Now we'll move to the third important idea which has a very prominent place in the philosophy of Kierkegaard, and that is the idea of despair. What is despair? According to Kierkegaard, despair is a condition of the self. There is no self, as I have already told you, which can exist or that can exist without despair. Despair is a precondition of human existence. Now, what this despair is? Kierkegaard says, despair is the sickness unto death, this tormenting contradiction, the sickness of the self, perpetually to be dying, to die and yet not die, to die death. And therefore, one has to understand that for Kierkegaard, despair originates from a failure to fully accept oneself as a synthesis of the finite and the infinite. What you have to understand here, that in Kierkegaardian universe, human being is both earthly and ethereal, both finite and infinite, both immanent and transcendent, both material and divine. And if one fails to realize or one fails to understand the divineness of the self, one is bound to encounter despair. As long as we are trapped into this material world, we are driven by this material world, our lives are determined by desires, earthly desires, desire for food, desire for place, desire for clothes, desire for higher things of comfort. It can be a car, it can be this, it can be that, it can be anything. As long as one is trapped only into material existence, one is bound to remain in despair. Of course, Kierkegaard talks about three kinds of despair which we need to discuss. First kind of despair is despair of not being aware of having a self, that is, living in ignorance of one's spiritual nature. What I have been saying is that if one is not conscious that one has divine essence, all that permeates in the world is part of that divine essence. Unless one has that consciousness, one would live in despair. So this is the first kind of despair in which an individual is not aware of being divine. Second type of despair is what Kierkegaard calls despair of not willing to be oneself. That is, rejecting one's true identity and potential due to fear or external pressure. Here you can say that when we are trapped into the material world, when we are trapped into material existence due to fear, due to greed, we may not recognize our true self. So that is the second form of despair. Third form of despair is despair of willing to be oneself. That is, trying to assert control over one's existence without acknowledging dependence of God. According to Kierkegaard, this third form of despair is because of spiritual sterility, is because of spiritual barrenness. When human beings do not realize, do not acknowledge that they are of divine substance, when they feel that they are only of this world, they are only earthly, and they indulge only into aesthetic life, only into a life of material pleasures, then they would suffer from this kind of despair. Now, how can this despair be overcome? This despair can be overcome, according to Kierkegaard, by true faith, by authentic believing. Alright? That Kierkegaard is considered one of the first and foremost existentialist philosophers, because Kierkegaard positions human beings or individuals at the center of his philosophy. He grants them a choice whether to choose to believe in God or to choose to not believe in God. That is a choice between living into an aesthetic life or leading a life of ethics, or what he calls ethical life. And therefore you have to understand that for Kierkegaard, existence becomes very important, and of course there is a scope for the idea of God also in his philosophy. Therefore he is often considered a theist existentialist philosopher. Now we would move to discuss another very important existentialist philosopher. His name is Jean-Paul Sartre. He was a French philosopher born in the year 1905 and he died in the year 1980. There are several great works that Sartre has composed. Some notable ones are Nausea, The Flies, No Exit, Being and Nothingness, Existentialism is a Humanism. Now the last two are important from our perspective. In Being and Nothingness, Sartre distinguishes between being for itself and being in itself. Being in itself refers to human consciousness, which is defined by freedom and choice. Being in itself refers to objects, things in themselves, which is fixed and unchanging. Existentialism is a Humanism is a very important essay that Sartre composed, and we will discuss this essay in great detail. This essay was a response to several charges labeled against existentialism by both communists and those people who were religious. Those who were religious argued that existentialism is a philosophy of pessimism, it is quietist, it is filled with despair, and therefore existentialists are not able to see on the brighter side of human life. They cannot see the beauty of God in life. That was the charge labeled against existentialists by religious people. Then there were communists who argued that existentialism was a bourgeois philosophy. It was a philosophy which did not want any action, which did not want any commitment. It was only a contemplative philosophy. Therefore, to defend existentialism of these charges, Sartre composed this essay. Now, what are the major arguments that Sartre makes in this essay? The first and the most important argument is that existence precedes essence. Those of us who have read Western philosophy, we know what is essence. For example, God created man, and God created man in his own image. So the idea of man in the mind of God is the essence. And all human beings that one sees, that one encounters in this world are copies of that idea, of that essence that God had in his mind while he created man. So the entire Western philosophy before argued that essence precedes existence. Sartre reversed that. He argues existence precedes essence. Why? Sartre says that individuals first exist without a predetermined purpose or identity. Only through their choices or action do they create their own essence. Now, Sartre's argument is that when man is born, man is nothing. Man is neither good nor evil. Man is neither divine nor earthly. Man is neither this nor that. Man is neither jealous or kind. Man is neither loving nor hateful. So you see, there is no essence. According to Sartre, we become what we choose to become. And therefore, the word becoming is very important. Being implies essence. Becoming implies process. So, man becomes in the process whatever he or she wills to become, because there is no God to determine what man has to become. There is no determinism. You must have heard of a very famous चौपाई होई है वही जो राम रचि राखा को कर तरख बढ़ावई शाखा. So you have to understand that there are philosophies which are deterministic, which believe that there is a God, that God has scripted our lives. We will become what gods want us to be. Shakespeare has famously said, we are to gods as flies are to wanton boys, they kill us for their sports. Now these are deterministic philosophies. Sartre is critical of any kind of determinism, even if it is divine determinism or transcendental determinism. So Sartre says that existence precedes essence. Human beings have freedom to become whatever they want to become. They have choice. That choice they have, and they have freedom. Related to this idea is the idea which Sartre very categorically says in that essay, and that is, man is condemned to be free. Now, these are very interesting words. Man is free, but man is condemned to be free. If someone is free, how can someone be condemned? Because we associate freedom with happiness, we associate freedom with liberation, we associate freedom with emancipation. So if human beings are free, why Sartre is calling them condemned? So let us understand, let us go deeper into this, and let us try to understand what Sartre means when he says man is condemned to be free. He says, humans possess the inherent freedom to make choices and define their lives. This freedom also brings a profound burden of responsibility and anxiety. Individuals cannot escape the necessity of making choices, which can lead to feelings of anguish and existential despair, as they must confront the consequences of their actions and the inherent lack of predetermined meaning in their lives. Now you have to understand here, if there is no God, because Sartre is an atheist, he does not believe that there is God. So if there is no God, what will happen to human beings? If there is a war happening in the world, who is responsible? Politicians are responsible. People are responsible. If children are dying young, who is responsible? Governments are responsible. People are responsible. Poverty is responsible. Malnutrition is responsible. Alright? So we cannot blame God for our mistakes, for our errors. So because there is no God, human beings have a lot of freedom. But the problem is, if they have freedom, they also have to understand that they also have responsibility. That if someone is dying prematurely, it is the human system which is responsible. If something bad is happening, humans are responsible. So they are responsible for the freedom that they have. That's why freedom is both emancipation and a burden. It becomes a burden upon human beings. Now, as long as there was God, it was okay. God was taking care of everything. You could be free of the guilt. Now there is no God, so you are responsible for whatever happens to you or to the people around you. And therefore, this freedom entails a lot of responsibility. Because of that, Sartre says, man is condemned to be free. So, I hope you have understood the meaning of the slogan, man is condemned to be free. I hope understood how Sartre is making human beings solely responsible for whatever is happening. Now, if human beings are responsible for whatever is happening, then suppose I choose to be good, or say I choose to be evil. Am I choosing only for myself, or am I choosing for everyone in the world? Now Sartre says, and I quote him, every one of us must choose himself, but by that we also mean that in choosing for himself, he chooses for all men. What does he mean by that? Suppose I choose to be good. I am not only choosing for myself, I am also choosing for the entire world, because when I choose to be good, I make it a moral imperative that all men will choose to become good. When I do something evil, I choose for everyone, because then everyone has freedom to become evil. If I am jealous, I am granting freedom to everyone to be jealous. If I am unkind, cruel, then I am granting freedom to everyone to become cruel and unkind. And therefore Sartre says, when human beings choose, they must choose carefully, because their choice is not only an individual choice, it is a universal choice. And therefore what Sartre does, he reduces universal to the individual. The role that God had in the world in the past, that role is now assigned to man. Man becomes God-like, man becomes responsible for whatever happens to him and to others in the world. Now there are three key words that we need to explain in order to understand this essay, Existentialism is a Humanism fully. And these three words are anguish, abandonment and despair. What is anguish? Anguish is something similar to what Kierkegaard was talking about. Anguish in Sartre refers to the deep anxiety or dread one feels when realizing that their absolute freedom and responsibility for their actions. As Sartre explains, this arises from understanding that there are no predefined rules to guide one's choices. See, there is a very famous play by Sartre, it's called No Exit. There are three characters, they meet in a room and they have been allotted that room by somebody and they start telling each other about their past lives. As the play progresses, we all come to know that they are lying to each other, and at a moment in the play they become so infuriated with each other's lies that they attack each other and they try to kill each other. Later on, at the end of the play, we come to know that they are in hell, they are already dead, therefore they cannot kill anybody. Now you see, if these characters have chosen to lie, alright, now they had freedom. They could have chosen to tell the truth to each other, or they could have chosen to tell a lie to each other. Of course, they chose to tell lies to each other. Now they had this freedom. Now because they had this freedom and because they lie, what it creates in them? It creates in them anguish. Alright? So we have to understand that anguish is a byproduct of the infinite freedom that we have, and because of the difficult choices one has to make. There is a story in the essay about a young boy who goes to Sartre and asks him whether he should serve his mother who is ill, who is old and there is nobody to take care of her, or he should go to avenge his brother's death in the war. Now you see, what could have been your suggestion? Sartre says, if you are a priest, you will say, choose this, choose to serve your mother, because serving your mother is very important. If you are a patriot or a politician, you would say, go and serve your country. If you are a teacher, your answer would be different. However, nobody is fully equipped to tell what that boy should do. According to Sartre, that boy must choose for himself. And he has this freedom to choose either to serve his mother or to serve his country. Now, you see, because he has this choice and because he has this freedom, he experiences anguish, and that's why he goes to Sartre to find out a solution to that anguish. So anguish is a very important word in Sartrean philosophy. Then there is another word called abandonment, and this idea has been developed from Nietzsche, who has famously said, God is dead. Now what is abandonment? Nietzsche says that Stemming from the idea that God is dead, abandonment expresses the existentialist belief that humans are left alone in a universe without divine guidance or inherent meaning, responsible for creating their own values. You see, I have already indicated, I have already hinted that there is no God in this universe, as Sartre puts it. So, if there is no God, whatever happens in the world, whether war is happening, cruelty is happening, violence is happening, who is responsible? Humans are responsible. And because there is no God, there is no divine guidance, human beings are responsible for creating their own values. Alright? So you have to understand, abandonment is also a very important word. It is a key word and it symbolizes or it represents atheist existentialism of Sartre. Finally, we move to despair, about which we have briefly discussed when we were talking about Kierkegaard. Despair, Sartre says, reflects the recognition that because we cannot control the outcomes of our choices or actions of others, we must accept uncertainty and the limits of our influence. Despair is the result of acknowledging the unpredictability of life and human freedom. Now you see, we have to understand, I am free as a human being, but other human beings are also equally free as human beings. Now I have control over my life, but can I control over your life or other people's life? And it's not that my life is controlled only by my choices. My life is also controlled by other people's choices. And when my desires will not be satisfied because of me or because of other people, what I will experience? I will experience despair. I will experience despair because of non-fulfillment of my desires. And therefore, despair would be born. Despair would be born as an outcome of unpredictability of life, or what Hegel calls historical situatedness of human beings. Because my life is also controlled by the times in which I am living. It is controlled by history. Of course, there is no God if we believe Sartre, but there is history which controls our life. So we have to understand that word anguish, abandonment and despair are also equally important in understanding Sartre and his philosophy. Now, what we make of all this, what we understand through this. You see, both Kierkegaard and Sartre are existentialist philosophers. Why they are existentialists? Because they argue that human beings are born without a fixed purpose and they must create identity or their subjectivity through their choices. Although Kierkegaard is theist, and therefore Kierkegaard would argue that man must turn to God to find out the meaning of his life, and Kierkegaard does not believe in God, and therefore he would say man must turn to himself to find out the meaning of life. So the first slogan of existentialism becomes meaningful, that existence precedes essence. Existentialism is also about subjectivity, where man becomes the guarantor of morality, man becomes godlike, man becomes the repository of all values that the society has, and therefore the focus shifts from God to man in existentialist philosophy. You also have to understand that because of abandonment of God, because of death of God, man becomes free, and because man is free, man is also responsible for whatever happens to him in the world. And of course, the idea of abandonment, despair, authenticity, anguish, we have already discussed. So we have to understand that all these essentialist ideas are linked to one central idea, which is our concern, and that idea is the idea of absurdity. And what is absurdity? That life lacks purpose, that life lacks meaning, that there is no God who controls life, there is no God who grants meaning to life, and because there is no God to grant meaning to life, man must find out his or her own meaning of life. And this idea of absurdity is our concern, which we would continue to discuss in the classes to come. Thank you, everyone. We'll meet next week to discuss another important philosopher, Albert Camus. Thank you.